Hi, this is the Well YouTube channel. If you're interested in our content, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Today we are presenting the webinar, Diversity and Inclusion in the Workplace, the first of our DEI series. Enjoy.
Welcome. I see a lot more people filing in. I do want to go ahead and get started so that we have time for, what I anticipate will be a great conversation and an opportunity to hear from all of our wonderful panelists. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the first installment of HireWell's new Diversity and Inclusion Speaker Series. For this inaugural panel, we'll be focusing on disability and neurodiversity inclusion in recruitment and hiring. Today also is World Autism Awareness Day, a day designed by the United Nations to raise awareness about people with autism spectrum disorders. So we just think it's a great fitting conversation to have about the ways that individuals with disabilities are vibrant and a lot of the time untapped resource in today's global marketplace. According to the CDC, 1 in 4 or 61 million Americans have a disability, effectively making them the largest minority group in the United States. Despite this, people with disabilities are often left out of the conversations on diversity and inclusion compared to the experiences of women, BIPOC individuals, and members of the LGBTQ+ community. So today we've got some experts in the field of disability, inclusion, and work. And I'm gonna start with myself. I'm Lisa Alvarado. I'm the Director of Facilitation at Holistic. We're a sister company of HireWell. At Holistic, we're a people analytics firm, and we really focus on employee experience, specifically with a DEI lens. So we spend a lot of time looking at the data at organizations to tell the story about what employees are experiencing around diversity, equity, inclusion, experience, and belonging. So I'll be passing it along now to our next panelist today, Nish, Parikh. Nish, if you'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, my name is Nish Parikh. I'm a CEO and co-founder of Rangam Consultants, where empathy drives innovation every day. We are a workforce solution company working with Fortune 500 companies and building some innovative workforce solutions driven by our empathetic culture. And one of the thing which we do, which is we are really proud of, is we promote employment for everyone, inclusive of people on the autism spectrum, people with disability, and disabled veterans. And thank you for the opportunity to come and speak and talk about disability inclusion and at workplace.
Of course, we're looking forward to it. Next, I'd like to welcome panelist Larry Worth.
Thanks for having me. I am also with Rangam, and I'm an executive there with Nish. And I work directly on our Source Able program, which is a program that works with large Fortune 500 companies to help them create programs that attract, hire, onboard, support, and retain people with disabilities, autism, and other neurodiversities.
Thank you so much for that, Larry. And our final panelist today is Mike Hess.
Hello, thank you, Lisa, for the intro, and super excited to be here with Larry and Nish. I run an organization called Blind Institute of Technology. We help professionals with disabilities find gainful employment opportunities. Across the Fortune 10,000, we work with the small and large brands all across the globe, and we are the official training provider for the broader professionals with disabilities for Salesforce globally.
Wonderful. Looking forward to speaking to you all today. So now that we've gotten some introductions out of the way, just a matter of housekeeping, we're really looking forward to having a great conversation, but we recognize as members of the audience and as part of the webinar, if you have questions throughout or you'd like some more information on something, feel free to drop a message into the chat. And we'll have some time toward the end for question Q&A, or depending upon the subject matter, we might splice those into the conversation. So thanks. So to get started today, I really wanted to start with some basics. Any of you can answer this. How should we be defining disability or neurodiversity in the context of our conversation today? What individuals or whom might we be speaking about? I don't want to make any assumptions about people's awareness.
Yeah, I think that as part of our conversation, as the ADA defines the broad disability, that is the umbrella of everything that we're going to talk about, and all the different talent populations that fall within that category, whether they have a physical, a sensory, a neuro disability, intellectual disabilities, as well as autism and neurodiversities, and really truly emotional as well. So, they all fall underneath that category. So, today and this month just happens to be the World Autism Month. So autism gets a lot of attention, which is great. And anytime that we can, as a collective society, bring attention to the needs of these type of diverse populations is wonderful. So having a conversation like this is wonderful to talk about and highlight autism. But really, when we talk about employment, we're talking about the broader get, right? The broader population. So for here, we'll talk about disabilities abroad, overall, neurodiversities, which then autism rolls underneath that as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Did Mike or Nish, anything else to add in regards to outlining whom we're speaking about today?
Well, from a BIT perspective, we really have a very specific focus on like the professional aspect. Unfortunately, there's a large trend, and I do not believe that Larry and Nish is part of this, but within the broader people with disabilities community who kind of lump into the food, filth, and fauna category for people with disabilities historically. And I think what Larry and Nish are doing and what BIT is doing is really focusing on, again, the corporate space, right? So when talent comes to us and they come to us globally, that's really our delineation, is that we're really focused on the professional component of the disability community.
Yeah.
And one of the things
No, I was just going to say, Mike, you probably recognize this as well. When I first got into this industry, they said, oh, you can't go talk to these corporations about people with disabilities. They won't talk to you. They'll send you to their corporate office. And so, I was like, okay, well, watch me, I'll go do that. And so now we really are, corporations starting to lead the way. We still have the local companies who are hiring, which is wonderful. And they're getting more and more diverse in the type of jobs that are out there. Like you referenced, the target used to be the food, the filth and the flowers, as you said. But now, now it's a whole different ballgame. The past 4, 5, 6 years, those talent acquisition leaders in corporations are really starting to see the benefit of hiring people with all the disabilities. So that's wonderful to see. And I definitely remember when it wasn't like that.
We talk about the neurodiversity and autism, right? We are talking about Autism Awareness Month and Autism Inclusion Month. I always talk about it is an invisible disability, right? So that is one of the things which makes it a little complicated for organizations and all of us to understand and build those programs around that. Because some of these things which is not very obvious, and that's where one of the challenge when we talk about employment for people on the autism spectrum and neurodiverse talent, that's where the challenge of unemployment is.
Nish, I'm so happy you brought that up, because I think historically when we think about the 1990 American with Disabilities Act, that really was speaking specifically to accessibility. And a lot of that focus were on physical manifestations of the disability, as we think that we can see them with the eye, but recognizing that there's a continuum and diversity of disability, both visible and invisible, and what type of things that employers, in the marketplace should be thinking about, and how they can bring these individuals into the fold at their organizations and, have resources to support them. So going along those lines, why do you think there's a trend toward more companies seeking out candidates with a disability, or recognizing that this is a very untapped talent pool?
I would say, there are some organizations like SAP and JP Morgan Chase and Microsoft of this world, and Ernst & Young and others. One of the things which we have seen in last few years, they have built some amazing programs, but more importantly, they have identified, or they have built those success stories which has really kind of created that influence in the whole society and the corporate world, where the success stories has highlighted and demonstrated some of those strengths which neurodiverse talent bring to the table, to the organization, which companies were not aware of. So that's one part of it, but I would love to get Larry and Mike's take on this.
Well, one of the trends that I've kind of seen, from Harvard to Nike to Winn-Dixie, so many lawsuits out there from the user experience perspective. If your digital assets are not accessible to all users, there are the very infamous case of Domino's taking it all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, the conservative Supreme Court, I might add, said, no, the lower courts had this right. So Domino's was attempting to say, like, hey, the internet as we know it came after ADA. And so public accommodations, though, extends into the digital domain space. And that's what the lower courts had to say. And so you have all these, and it's literally thousands of cases that are being brought to the federal and state level courts every single year now. And so from a digital accessibility perspective, right, these organizations are realizing, like, okay, well, we don't speak that language. Like our IT group, we speak cybersecurity, we speak network ops time, we speak, all these fundamental IT things, but we don't speak the language of accessibility. So let's bring in, individuals, right, that just happen to be, whether they're blind or deaf or neurodiverse, let's bring them in to help us with these tasks of making our environments accessible. So for the first time ever, Microsoft, yes, a very neurodiverse, successful program, but for the first time ever, they have 300 blind or low vision people on their campus in the Seattle offices as well. So making sure that their software is inclusive to everybody.
Thank you so much for that, Mike.
Yeah, I think need creates necessity. And so, before COVID hit, it was a pretty rough job market out there. There are a lot of open positions, and there's a lot of competition, and that was for a few years leading up to COVID. And so, a lot of times companies were looking for talent, and where could they find more talent? The corporation may have had a connection to a local nonprofit or some other organization, and they hired someone because they needed good talent, and they had a great experience. That they realized that, hey, oh my gosh, this was wonderful experience. How can we replicate this and bring in more and more and more? If you look at the ADA, and we're almost 31 years removed from that legislation, yet we're still at like double unemployment rate for people with disabilities. And as you start, drilling down into various different disabilities, it gets significantly worse. And people with, developmental disabilities, 66% unemployment, people with autism, 86%, and most of them, a lot of them are underemployed, taking jobs that, are easy to get rather than jobs that are within their skill level. And so when you have this type of talent that's out there, the goal is to give them an avenue, give them vision into these positions that are seeking to hire them. And I think, that's part of what now you're starting to see is people with disabilities across the board are having more access and more visibility to all these open jobs that before they may have not looked at because it was with a large corporation or because it wasn't necessarily in their backyard or something like that. But that's changing as these big companies like Microsoft and some of those that Nish said, and JP Morgan and others are being very vocal and being very visible about their hiring programs. Other companies are catching on. Other companies are like, well, if they're going to do it, we're going to put it out there. And so, they're putting it out there, and now you're starting to see a trend of where people who may not, with disabilities, who may not have traditionally sought those type of positions are now seeking them, and which is wonderful. This is where we are. And really, honestly, COVID hasn't slowed that down. It's changed some because of how we work, but we haven't seen the dramatic. We saw a hit on unemployment for everybody. That's inclusive of people with disabilities, but that rebound is starting as well.
Right. A theme that I heard across some of the commentary that you all just gave is that the impetus for much of this interest around hiring folks with disabilities, is this movement from really historically reactive to proactive. And this is most certainly the similar situation across any other types of DEI hiring. It was that, diversity, equity, and inclusion is something that an organization did or put money behind when they were, reacting to lawsuits about there wasn't access or resources, or individuals who met a diversity standard did not have the same experience in the workplace. and now recognizing that they've got to get ahead of this and be proactive because, whether it's around, the racial reckoning of 2020, where organizations recognized that they were out of touch, that they didn't have a good representative diversity, or they didn't have people, at the table who could be seen and heard in their decision making, in their PR, in their marketing, in their branding, who they are, how inclusive the organizations were. And so I think it's really interesting that though individuals with disability are often left out of this conversation, or kind of like the last ad after we talk about race and gender and sexuality, it's a very similar experience, and much more recent.
Talk about this, that it's not a charity, it's these individuals that bring unique abilities in some cases and all kind of abilities. So it's up to us how we do that matching and help as a workforce solution company. And it's not about charity, it's a true value proposition for corporations when they hire people with disability.
And I think also just not making the mistake of having someone's disability define them. Like, it's most certainly a part of their identity, but it's not the totality. And disability is one of those places where intersectionality is. So, folks could be hiring for diversity. You can be hiring a woman with a disability, a person of color, someone who checks many of these boxes and has multiplicity of experiences that they can bring to the table. And like you said, bring that true value. As companies are becoming aware of the value that neurodiversity talent brings, what would you recommend small or mid-sized employers do to incorporate or create an inclusion program within their organizations?
Mainly there are two factors in my view. One is processes and people, right? So one is in terms of our hiring processes, hiring practices, onboarding processes, interview processes, how we write job description. So some of those processes, companies, that's a first step, looking at that and make sure that and evaluate that. And Larry always talk about universal design system. Some of those best practices are out there, and leverage some of that. And then second piece is people, right? People inside and outside, because when we build this disability inclusion programs, one of the biggest thing which we focus on is how do we build that trusted relationship between employee and employer, right? And that comes from the communication, that comes from some of those actions companies are taking place. So internally, as well as how they are communicating with external world, so that people with disability sees that there is a company is open and are really embracing the diversity as part of their workforce strategy, and that makes a big difference in attracting the talent.
So from the beginning, before we even talk about someone being hired and looking for that inclusive culture internally, employers creating brands and making themselves attractive and accessible, and people being fully aware that this is where they stand and that they are interested in not just bringing on this talent but supporting them to help them thrive. Larry or Mike, anything else around how these organizations, particularly smaller employers, like we know we spoke about some of the corporate, can build those inclusivity programs?
Sure. So for me, I love that people and process for sure. I always call it the holy trifecta, though. It's people, process, and tools, which kind of create that total ability to really make anything happen. Like then nothing happens without those three components. And I dare say cash is the fourth, but the holy trifecta, because so many times, like for instance, one of the engagements we had with Oppenheimer, which has been, they merged with Invesco out of Atlanta now, but they had us look at their talent acquisition site, right? So to make sure they want to be very inclusive. And so they had us make sure that because if your site, how you're drawing people in to apply for a job X, Y, or Z, they had a great video from their CEO that very impassioned, talking about what a great work culture we have and how inclusive we are and everything else. It didn't have closed captions on it. So again, people, process, and tools. So for an organization, and again, to get your videos, if so much marketing happens, especially with the smaller brands on their multimedia, right? There's videos being created, there's podcasts being created. Make sure that all of that is inclusive. So people, process, and tools, to me, create that holy trifecta for an organization to have a strategic advantage of recruiting and retaining talent from a diverse population.
Absolutely, Mike. I absolutely agree with both you and what Nish is saying as well. And I got my start going door to door to small companies and being very proactive, saying I have a person who I want you to take a look at who I think could be a match for you. And the question that we always get is, where do we start? How do we do that? Where do we start? And I always say, let's look at your attraction, your interviewing, and your onboarding. Okay, and then we'll tackle support later. Okay. But right now, let's look at these three things, because attraction is, you got to put yourself out there. You got to put yourself out there and let them know that you want to hire them. You are actively looking to hire their skills and abilities, and so put yourself out there. Be vocal, and then look at your interviewing and onboarding process, because these are two greatest barriers to bringing people in. And so, how are you interviewing? There's a lot of biases that go into interviewing, affinity bias and affirmation bias and all these different things that go into interviewing. And so, a lot of times we like to hire people that we just get a good gut feeling about. And that's usually because they're likable, or they're like, we feel good about them. Where someone with a disability, that interview may be a little bit untraditional, what they're used to. And so, getting through that, how to work that, and then once you do hire them, then what is that process to get them integrated into your work environments? So whether it's a small or whether it's large, things like like doing videos for some of your onboarding training, and making sure that there's closed captioning and all those different accessibilities that are there, and then bring them into an environment that has natural support, so people around understand and have some insight into general disabilities, autism, neurodiversities, blind, deaf, what have you. But bring them into an environment that they'll be supported just like we would support anybody else. So, if you're looking at something that, you're sitting there going, wow, this sounds really good, and I want to do that, that's where we typically recommend you start.
Thank you. So really, setting folks up for success. And I feel like this is a similar conversation when organizations are thinking about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. The big focus for, historically is on the diversity. We need more representative diversity. We're going to put some resources behind that, like Mike said, a little bit of cash, and that's going to solve all our problems. But as we know, for every other group, and now specifically for folks with disabilities, if you haven't set up a system, kind of done an audit of your culture to determine where that bias might be represented, starting in the interview process, but continuing on into your company culture, and there are not resources to support these individuals, then you're going to have attrition, or you're going to have, kind of setting these folks up to fail, because you're not creating environments where they can thrive and grow and show their expertise and their knowledge base. So that's definitely important. And I wouldn't say I dare you say cash, Mike. I'd say absolutely cash is the important part, because I think a lot of people get kind of rah-rah around DEI, but they're not willing to kind of put the same resources behind it as they do with other company business goals, recognizing that, those things go hand in hand, and you've got to kind of tie them together and have DEI be that thread that goes throughout for these things to be successful. Well, thank you for those. Next, I want to talk about what are some of the myths that individuals or organizations have about hiring people with disabilities.
Go ahead, Mike. We'll have you start.
I've gotten questions like, just silly stuff. But again, if you don't know, you don't know. So it's not silly. And part of my job is to make it like less, not silly. It's like, it's okay to ask these questions. Like it's completely okay. But so how do you find the bathroom? I mean, literally, you'd be amazed at, can you email? So much of like when I talk about people, process, and tools, so much of the tools, it goes back to the how component. So how do people with disabilities actually do what they do, right? And this is, blind, deaf, neurodiverse. The leading cause of disability per the World Health Organization now is anxiety, it's depression, right? Because there's been a little angst going on both politically and socially, the pandemic. Like, this is a for real thing. And there are technologies, biomedical technologies, that actually are part of your app that are paying attention to your vitals to say, hey, you're being triggered, so let's send you something to help you with your trigger, right? So technology is a huge thing, not just for blind people, not just for deaf people, with the closed captioning and this amazing AI that's happening, that it's not perfect, but boy, it's so much better to see that technologies are integrating this. And by the way, these accessible technologies, right, that help people with disabilities overcome that how hump, what I call the how hump. It's also like, there are so many sighted teams now that are using the closed captioning part of teams, part of the meets, and they're using that for their meeting notes. So they can go back and say, oh, no, look, we talked about this in this meeting, and it's searchable now. So accessible technology for the how hump is actually good for everybody.
Thank you so much for those great examples, Mike. Absolutely. And I think that's a great way to frame the conversation, that investing in XYZ technology or systems or tools are going to be to make us more effective at attracting and retaining diverse talent. But as an organization, it'll make us more effective, efficient in XYZ ways, because these are things that we can all utilize. Anytime, you're making business more effective or efficient, it's going to be more successful.
One of the things that we run, and it's like Mike said, you don't know what you don't know, right? When we start talking about hiring and OKRs and KPIs for positions that hire people with disabilities, there's a big myth is that you don't have to lower your standards, and honestly, you shouldn't lower your standards. They're hired to do the job. If you hire someone who's qualified, again, if you look at hiring as hiring qualified people instead of hiring for charity. Charity is someone can't do the work and you hire them because you want to feel good about it or help them. A real hiring comes around hiring people who are qualified, who just, oh, by the way, happen to have disability. And so when you hire someone into that position with a disability, your expectation or your standard doesn't go down. It's how can you support the person to ensure that they have the tools or the accommodations necessary to perform at that level. Okay, they can absolutely perform it. They may need some sort of small accommodation, or accommodation could be like leaving 5 minutes early to go to the bathroom before your break. And it doesn't have to be cost-based, and most aren't. They could be like, instead of having like anyone sits anywhere when you come in, having an assigned spot for them. These are all little things that ease that anxiety Mike is talking about and helps them focus more on a day rather than something that isn't going right for them, and allows them to then perform at the level expected of that position. And so I think it's a big myth. You don't ever lower your standard, okay? But what can you put around the person to help them be successful?
Right.
Other common thing which we have seen is that hiring people on the autism spectrum or neurodiversity at work program it's well known that people on the spectrum, they have been successful in the IT jobs, but that's not the only jobs they can do. Means we know that it's a spectrum. Autism is a spectrum where every individual brings different kind of their strengths, and it's up to us how we map those strengths into different jobs. So our mission is to, we always start with something where employers are passionate about, because that's what they know. So they let's start with IT jobs. But our ultimate goal is how do we expand and broaden that because IT jobs are not for all individuals on the autism spectrum. So that's also one of the very common myths we have about.
People ask me all the time, like, so what can blind people do, right? And I'm like, well, listen, if I'm the Uber driver that pulls up in front of you, don't get in the car, okay? But don't limit me. I say if it's a desk jockey type position, and there's so many more positions in that, but I'm always thinking of the professional workspace. That's my environment. However, again, I know blind people who are chemistry teachers at the University of Chicago. I know blind people who do just amazing things all over the place. So we're not limited, we, the people with disabilities community, we're not limited by much. I mean, it's truly like, it's the limitations are actually put on right, by society, these society norms, right? Like if we don't have to go far back in time, Lisa, right? You sound to me like you identify as a female, and 35 years ago, if you ask what were the top three professions for females, what were they? Right. And it's not that females couldn't do other professions. However, they were put in a box.
Yeah.
Right. And there were these very, you could be a nurse, you could be an EA, you could be a teacher. Like those were the norms. And I think in today's, the 2020, 2021, this idea of inclusion now is allowing us to start, like, let's stop, putting people in boxes for whatever social norm perspectives and start looking at it as, like, again, if people process and tools have the right capabilities, you'd be amazed at what you can draw in. And then, of course, again, you look at like organizations who are truly inclusive with hiring from the people with disabilities community, like they outperform their peers by like 28% from a net revenue perspective. Like this is not like organizations that do this, there's a real return on that investment as well.
So I would call that boundaryless inclusion, right?
Yeah. That's right. And Nish, we get a lot of that question, like, what jobs are good for people with disabilities? What jobs are good? And we'll always say, let's level set and say all jobs are good for people with disabilities. But, finding the talent that meet your job, depending on where it is, what the requirements of the job, it may take a little bit longer to find the right person. But let's start with the concept that, if the position is out there, there's probably someone with disability that can do it. And so, we try to level set that and go from there. As you said, Mike, maybe driving isn't the best, but there might be someone out there with a disability who that is a great job for.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I've gotten picked up by multiple completely deaf Uber drivers. And it's that old joke, like what happened? A blind man and a deaf man walk into a bar, right? It's a start to a joke. But guess we were able to communicate seamlessly through technology.
Beautiful.
Absolutely.
So that's the thing. That's the beauty of, again, people processing tools. When that's in harmony, like organizations not only get a return on that investment, like you'd be amazed at what kind of talent that, oh, by the way, I have a small chip on my shoulder. Like, I live in the Mile High City. It's a mile high and a mile wide because I've been discounted so often because of my cane, but I'm a badass engineer. I've managed 7- and 8-figure projects in my corporate career. And it's not despite my blindness, it's because of my blindness. I've had to work twice as hard for half as much. Like that's the kind of population that people bring in, is we got a little bit of something to prove sometimes.
For sure. I think that's a fantastic point that you're making, Mike. I think that that's a huge miss because I think that individuals, whether it's because of a physical, emotional, or other type of disability, the grit that it takes to do the things, the day-to-day, the discipline, kind of the heart, you have to have some of that gusto. And I think it's ironic because those are precisely the things that most of these organizations, small or large corporation, would say that they're hiring for. Exactly. They're looking for, the person that, in order to get somebody who's innovative, right? You had to be innovative from whether you were born with your disability or you developed it. In every day of your life, things that many differently abled or more able-bodied individuals take for granted, right? So it's super important to think about those points of view, those perspectives, those experiences, and how they're so rich, and they're going to level up any organization because those things are missing from, even if XYZ consulting firm or tech firm thinks they're doing fantastic, it's like, what part of the market are you not serving because you don't have individual representation internally who recognizes the needs of those populations? And what other ways could you do things? What better ways? How can you enhance your processes? And kind of, we touched on this earlier about the how. Even, the most well-intentioned employers, they might be eager to diversify their staff, but there's often that unspoken or sometimes spoken, frequently spoken apprehension about, well, how do disabled team members, perform their jobs, or folks with disabilities, how might they perform? And you spoke to that quite a bit, Mike. What I'd like to talk about a little bit, and that's where we really talked about these, people, processes, and tools, and putting these things in place to create those supportive and inclusive environments where individuals with disabilities can thrive. But I'd like to talk a little about what kind of training might a manager or a colleague or the other individuals in those organizations need in order to best support and work with, folks who do have disabilities?
There's some amazing organizations that have really, really good training. I would say, nowadays, a lot of it is about awareness and things like that. I'd venture to say, you know what? I think we're pretty aware at this point that people with disabilities and autism neurodiversities exist and that they're going into the workforce. So with that understanding, what kind of training can provide some insight? What kind of training can provide some insight into what they might be experiencing, so that can help create empathy. We don't necessarily want sympathy, because sympathy means I feel bad for someone and their situation. Empathy means I understand them, and I know some strategies to help support when they may need that support. Even those of us who've been interviewing for years, I think there's always something that we can learn from a good interviewing training. So I would say go in to see what you're looking for, what your needs are, and trust me, you can find some good training. Now, if you want to look at like very specific training, because one time we helped place someone who had epilepsy, and they wanted to provide some education to the teams that they were going to work on, and so that person was actually involved in the training and talked about his epilepsy and said, hey, look, if it happens, don't be shoving anything in my mouth, like those type of things. You can get as specific as you want with training, but at the very least, something that will provide some insight. I think insight creates comfortability, it creates empathy, and I always say, hey, look for something that's there.
And the way I see that, it's not about people with disability, it's about the organization and how we create that inclusive culture, right? So that's one of the things at Stanford University, we did this virtual job fair for people on the spectrum. And we asked this one question, that when you are looking for employers, what is the one thing which you look for? And one of the common answer was that I want to work for the company where I'm not misunderstood, right? And that awareness, that training, and as Larry said, all that is so important, so important. And one of the other very critical piece is that one training is not end of the story, right? It's not end of the process. It has to be ongoing, because as we are all as a whole, as a society, as a whole, as an organization, and subject matter experts in this field, we are constantly learning new things. So we want to constantly share those learnings and make sure that everybody is aware and there is a consistent awareness throughout the organization.
Thank you so much for that, Nish. One thing I'd like to call out, Mike, you're not able to see, but today Nish's shirt says empathy. So we're definitely, that's definitely a buzzword. And it's, I think, one of the most important things that the two of you highlighted in what you were just stating, this idea that really it's about some emotional intelligence, right? In any organization or team, particularly for leaders, emotional intelligence or high EQ are imperative, to really creating good environments where people feel like they're able to thrive, they feel well supported in the instances when you do have crises arise or, necessary to utilize your conflict resolution skills. It's so important. The reason I was really asking the question is the feeling around that, say, individuals with disabilities frequently have to they have to assimilate into a culture or, make it work, figure it out. And really, I think that it's an understanding that, like you said, it's not on the individual with the disability niche, it's the organization's job to be inclusive and create an environment that's going to, envelop them and welcome them and ensure that they're well supported to do the job that they're hired to do. I want to talk a little bit about sourcing. What do you say to employers who are interested in hiring people with disabilities, but they claim or they feel they're not sure of where you might find them?
Well, I get asked that all the time. I mean, large organizations, large, small, doesn't matter. They'll say we're totally an inclusive hiring place. We don't have anybody that's interviewing, that's coming through the pipeline. That's this and that. And it's no different than, let's go from the ethnic point of view, like saying, well, how are we supposed to get more Black or African American people to apply? Well, if you're sourcing, still going to the same, universities that have low numbers versus going to the HBCUs, right? So where are you attempting to source your talent from? And it's really critical. It doesn't matter the demographic, right? But there are so many organizations that support the broader people with disabilities community in every state across the country, every city across the globe. There are those organizations that are out there. However, are you and your talent acquisition team, are you intentionally going there and creating those relationships? So for you to say like, oh, I've built my business, they shall come, like that attitude has got to shift a little bit, and you've got to start thinking about like, how are you sourcing? How are you looking to recruit your talent? Are you intentionally going out there and actually shaking hands? Like if I'm the first blind person you've ever met, I'm sorry for you. Like if you've never attempted to engage in a conversation with somebody who is deaf, I'm really sorry for you. Because that's the part where all of a sudden you as a person, as somebody who's trying to source, talent acquisition, you're going to grow in your sourcing capabilities when you intentionally go and start looking for those demographics.
Right. Being purposeful and not, just waiting for folks to fall in your lap. And,
Right.
I feel like that's a common refrain for DEI hiring in general. Where or how, or also I think a lot of the times many folks, you go back to the same well, right? If you're doing good and your thirst is quenched, you know where to go. This is where I'm going to source. But you've got to, this is purposeful work. As Nish was saying earlier, this is not a one and done, whether it's a training or whether it's a part of, it becomes part and parcel to what you're doing. You've got to stand up these goals and, set some measurable, KPIs around them. We want to hire this much for diversity. We want to reach this many individuals who might have a disability, and we want to educate ourselves a bit, because we recognize before we step into this pool, we want to make sure we're well suited to meet these individuals and greet them and welcome them into our organization.
One of the things I always share, that there is no monster.com or hotjobs.com concept, right? When we talk about people with disability. But most important, we also know that 1 out of 4, as Lisa, you mentioned, 1 out of 4 has visible or invisible disability in the United States. That makes it 61 million people. So people are applying for a job to your organization. We just don't know. Okay, so it's a process is very critical, and that trusted, and Larry always talk about that, self-identification, and some of those challenges are true challenges when it comes to identifying and tracking in terms of so that we can measure our success from the disability inclusion program. Larry, your thoughts?
Absolutely. Yeah, when you're sourcing, just like with any program, you have internal and external strategies, right? So, external strategies, and there's many companies out there, great, nonprofit organizations, for-profit organizations, large and small, that support people with disabilities that seek employment. LinkedIn is becoming a great source for the autism community, neurodiversity community. It's getting bigger. So accessing those, again, same thing like Mike, you said, with the colleges, accessing those are all external reach. But then there's a whole internal factor as well. Again, 1 in 4 people have disability. Over 30% of households at least have one person with disability. 40% of all people will get a disability of some sort, whether it's temporary or permanent at some point in time. You have people with disabilities and people who have connection to people with disabilities in your organization right now. And so reaching out to them, creating an environment that is welcoming and supportive of people with disabilities is the first step. And then those that work for you, that either have that or have a connection, then they're your recruiters as well. They're having a good experience. They tell people, they tell a family member, they raise their hand and say, hey, I have a disability and I have someone who wants to come work for us. Are you going to get large amounts of people? Maybe not, but you may not need large amounts of people. Maybe that's what the external is for. But as you start sourcing, we always encourage to have that external strategy, but also start looking internal as well, because they're there. And just like you said, Lisa, when we talk about diversity in general, we talk about all these different sectors. Well, disability, permeates throughout all of them. And they're the truest form of diversity. Disability is diversity. It's not bound by gender, religion, sexual orientation, ethnicity. It permeates throughout all society. So you really can't have a talent acquisition strategy without disability. And even if you're going out and you're bringing in, you're going out and attracting ethnicity, you bring out attracting women, you bring out attracting LGBTQ. Guess what? You're attracting people with disabilities right along with it. What the key is having an avenue that they feel supported going through that process, and they will apply. Again, you put yourself out there, and then you got to be prepared for when they start coming in.
Thank you for that, Larry. That segues perfectly to my last question. So a lot of people are still fearful of disclosing their disabilities as they feel they do not want to lose an opportunity, but employers are looking for them. So how can companies showcase that they are inclusive and they are interested in hiring individuals with disabilities?
Messaging. Like everything comes down to messaging, right? I mean, your branding. If on your website, like there's just, 4 white guys in white t-shirts, right, that are above 40, like everything is about the messaging. And if I get on a website as a blind person and I'm not able to scroll around on your web screen, I know immediately. Like we think that there's some kind of rocket surgery to any of this, looking and sounding and feeling inclusive. It's absolutely not.
Yeah.
And after the messaging, the next step is taking the action, right? And demonstrating that they are really doing it. So in certain cases, it's very obvious related to in certain areas, but there are certain areas which, can demonstrate if they have a formal program. And then of course, communicating and showing them some of the numbers, because I know numbers are not very important, and these numbers, we have not seen big numbers, but still it matters. It's one placement, one inclusive placement at a time, and that itself demonstrate, and that builds that trusted environment, trusted culture where company, if individuals, when they are applying, they will be able to put that trust and share their self IDs, right?
Yeah, definitely. What I'm hearing from you all is that transparency is crucial at that stage, in addition to going out and seeking out individuals with disabilities for hiring, but having that transparency so that when they come upon you, they come to your job, whether it's your job description or the land on your DEI page, seeing themselves represented, seeing some vulnerability and transparency in the data, as Nish is saying, maybe they might not have a large portion of the organization that fits that standard, but the fact that they have placed or, onboarded anyone in those ways, and then specifically to those tools and resources that Mike was speaking to, whether it's the closed captioning, making the websites accessible to visually impaired or hearing impaired individuals. Like you said, it's not rocket science, right? Getting back to the basics and making sure that from the very first interactions and touch points that individuals have with your organizations, it's clear that there's a place for them internally. And I think that's something that anyone who knows me and have had these conversations around sourcing and hiring and things like that, as a woman or as the person of color, I always say that that's the first thing, before you might have a feel for the industry or the organization, and it might have a great name. But if I've scrolled through your website, go through multiple tabs, and I don't see myself represented in any way, shape, or form, or your initiatives or the things you've got going on, how likely am I to create a story for myself that this is an organization that would value me and I would have a successful opportunity for advancement in your organization? So I think those things are great. I want to thank you guys for a fantastic conversation. You have given us so much knowledge today. For everybody on the call, please follow these brilliant men and leaders and their organizations on LinkedIn, on their websites, hire them as consultants, as trainers to educate and really continue this conversation, because this is such a rich and not yet well enough tapped resource of our community. And I was so honored to moderate this panel, and so excited to continue learning and growing with you all. We hope that everybody will use it as an opportunity for some more education and celebration. Thank you, and hire well. And I'd like to thank the committee that put this on, our education committee of Jack, Robin, and Leah. They did some great work in connecting some brilliant individuals, and we look forward to more of these conversations as part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion speaker series that HireWell has put together. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.